Welcome back. If you've missed any previous episodes, they can be found on the YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple Music, and Rumble, and they can all be found by the same name. So, if you missed anything and want to catch up on how these things tie together, because everything gets a little bit deeper every time, but they're all connected to each other. You can refer back to those episodes, or you can just start here. It really doesn't matter. Um, Just everything just kind of builds. And today I want to talk about listening. Everyone says they do it, but do they really? You know, does intelligent listening actually happen today? Maybe not in some circles, but it's something that everything needs to be worked on. Everything can be worked on, but today, especially listening, you know, that's what I want to dive into today. So, let's get into it, and let's start with a statement that's probably going to upset some people. Most here's a statement: most modern mainstream music does not require intelligent listening, not emotional listening, not background listening, but intelligent listening. And that's not because listeners got worse. It's because the music stopped asking more of them. Okay, this episode is not about what your taste is. It's not about different genres. It's not about nostalgia. It's about design. Because for most of human history, music was intentionally constructed, built on systems of harmony, tension, release, counterpoint, form, and long range musical thinking. Yeah, and today, most mainstream music is just assembled, like I've said before, it's not composed, and things are not the same. Those two things are not the same thing. So, what intelligent listening actually means? Okay, let's define terms before people start arguing in comment sections and just being dumb. So, intelligent listening does not mean you need a music degree or you need to name chords, or you need to understand theory vocabulary. It means the music contains internal logic that rewards attention. It means harmony goes somewhere. The melody develops, not just repeats. The rhythm breathes and reacts. Form has direction. Musical ideas evolve. This is why you can listen to older music repeatedly and still discover new things. Okay, the music has depth, not just surface. Okay, and it wasn't accidental. You know, Music was built on compositional systems. Okay, before popular mainstream music became what it is now, musicians learned their craft from compositional lineages. Yeah, they learned from classical composers like Bach. They weren't just writing nice melodies. They were working with counterpoint, voice leading, harmonic function, motivic development. Fast forward to now, to like the 20th century. Jazz musicians, they didn't reject this knowledge, they expanded on it. Artists like Miles Davis, he studied harmony deeply. They understood modes, chord substitutions, harmonic tensions, form over long improvisations. Even early rock musicians weren't ignorant of this lineage. The Beatles, they were openly inspired by classical harmony, the Baroque counterpoint, composers like Bach and Mozart. This is why their songs move, not emotionally only, but they structurally move. Okay. Songs, they used to be composed and not just optimized. Okay. Here's where the modern divide really begins. Older music was written to be performed by humans. Shocking, isn't it? Remembered and to be remembered over time. Reinterpreted live, survive outside the studio. Modern mainstream music is often written to be just consumed quickly, loopable, algorithm friendly, immediately recognizable. The shift, it changed everything. Now, in older music, verses and choruses they contrast, bridges modulate, or refrain from the harmony. Melodies they respond to the lyrics. Harmonies supports emotional narrative. In much of today's mainstream music, harmony barely moves. Melody stays within a narrow pitch. Rhythmic patterns they loop unchanged. The form exists to get back to the hook as fast as possible. It's not evolution of music, that's reduction. You know, like the sayings of like progress is regression in most popular culture. And that's true. The less is they've taken the less is more and took it to an extreme. In music, less is just less. It doesn't clear anything up. It doesn't inspire anything but robotic responses. It's everything based on like everything looping back in a robotic way tends to make the listeners more robotic and less intelligent. I'm sorry, but that's the way it actually happens and actually plays out no matter what kind of musical fantasy they may promise you in concert or on their albums. Okay, just having this concept of intelligent listening is very important. If you're listening to music, if you want to listen to it as background music, that's probably what relegates itself to. I've mentioned it in the previous podcast that modern music should be made elevator music, something you listen to for 10 seconds and get off the elevator to, because that's what they've reduced themselves to. Um, you know, like here's why modern music doesn't require much thinking. Okay, some more explanation here. So let's say the quiet part out loud. Most mainstream hits today can be understood fully within the first 15 seconds. Okay, there no harmonic surprise. Okay, no formal development, no long-term payoff. Now, that's not because listeners are incapable of more. It's because the music is designed not to ask for it. Older music trusted the listener. It assumed you could follow tension over time. You could feel delayed resolution. You could stay engaged without instant gratification. Today's music assumes you're distracted. You'll skip if you get bored. You need repetition immediately so the music meets that expectation. In doing so, it lowers the ceiling. It's kind of suggesting that everybody has ADD. It's not a good assumption in today's mainstream. For some that may be true. I'm sorry if I brought it up and it hits a nerve. Oh well, sometimes you do need to hit a nerve. But think of it as like mainstream music is for the shortened attention span because that's what it's assuming that's what you have. If it's something that you don't want it to assume about you, because, forbid anybody assumes anything, you might want to switch up your listening and get a little bit more intelligent listening in your life. And this is just geared toward anybody who claims to love music. It's something you should look into. And so, moving on to like the melody, and how it used to lead you somewhere, but now it hides. Okay, so listen to melodic writing of the older artists. Listen to Stevie Wonder. He didn't just sing the melodies, he developed them. You know, they made sure they had direction, they had range, call and response, rhythmic variation, and compare that to much of modern pop. Melodies today, they're often narrow in range, they're rhythmically static, secondary to production effects, repetitive by design. Why is that? Because melody is risky to them. It exposes pitch control, musical identity, memorability without effects. Production can hide weak melody. Harmony, it can't. So they minimize the harmony. So they're essentially, if they take these risks, they're exposing their lack of artistry, their lack of mastery of the craft. Okay. If they don't understand a simple call and response, that just exposes them as not really a musical artist, but really as a musical robot. Okay. So, like, taking these risks as artists in the past or composers in the past have, you compare the two side by side, today they fall really short. And they're failing in their crafts. They're failing as what they call themselves artists and stuff like that. They're failing at everything. And they're expecting you not to catch it. Okay. They don't think very highly of the people who listen to them. It's basically like they couldn't pass an elementary music class. At least they couldn't in the past. Think about that for a second. Okay. So let me explain harmony, the thing that disappeared quietly. Okay. So harmony is where intelligent listening it thrives. Music in the past, chords they had a function. Progressions they had a narrative to them. Modulation meant emotional shift. Even simple songs had harmonic intention. Okay. Today's mainstream music often uses the harmony as a static backdrop. One loop, one mood, no journey. That's not minimalism. Okay, that's avoidance. Because harmony they requires decision making, and decision making invites the risk. So why would they want to take a risk when they're not sure it's going to work? That's what they're thinking. Okay, they want to make sure something works, so they become a machine. Okay, they become this factory of musical crap because their computers or their robots or whoever's doing this in the industry tells them, hey, this works. This makes us the most money. This pulls the wool over their eyes. We've seen this in the past. So it's going to work, you know, and then we'll prove it to you by giving you a participation trophy called the Grammys. Okay. If that offended you, still, I still don't apologize, but it's truth. Okay. Look at it. Find the musical patterns in today's music. You can't. You can find one simple pattern. Their algorithm is doing its job and making you simple as a listener. That's all it is to it. Um, so how do you put this into like a practice that you can discover for yourself? Well, I'm gonna tell you. So like the artists, they used to study, right? you know, and who they study now, which is the telling secret. So here's a comparison that matters. Older musicians, they studied Bach, they studied Mozart, they studied Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, they studied classical orchestration, jazz harmony, folk traditions, modern artists. Who do they study? Okay, you guessed it. Playlist performance, viral trends, sound design presets, market behavior. It doesn't make them lazy necessarily, okay? Because they are looking into something, but are they looking into the right direction? All right. So it doesn't make them more creative. It makes them strategic. Okay. But like strategy is not composition. Metrics are not meaning. Okay. I know some mainstream stuff, meaning is confusing, especially in today's world when everyone tells you what everything means. Okay, but meaning can be more personal. Okay. Now, somebody out there is going to say, like, well, this mainstream has a different meaning to me. Yes, but is it meaning that's superfluous? You know, is it meaning that's vanity? Is it just surface? Because that stuff really doesn't matter. It doesn't create a long lasting connection to anything. It's surface stuff that doesn't matter. um, deeper meanings, deeper connections. Think Facebook connections. How many friends do you have on Facebook that you actually talk to? This is what we're talking about. Okay, not many people can say out of 300 friends they got on Facebook, they're friends with all 300 of them. They know their shoe sizes, their shirt sizes. They know when they broke their arm as a child, if they broke their arm as a child, what their dreams and aspirations were, and what their philosophy of life is. Okay, this is what we're trying to avoid in music. Sure, you can know the words to everything. Sure, you can figure out a looped beat by pushing buttons, but can you figure out a deeper meaning to the philosophy of why this was created? I'll give you a hint. In modern music, there is no philosophy. Okay, you're not going to find it. You're going to find sound bites. You're going to find buzzwords, buzz phrases, anything that connects with a Google search and puts it on top. Okay, that's all you're going to find in today's music. You're not going to find a deeper meaning of, explanations of life or anything. You're not going to find anything that older composers that lend to tradition to building music. You're not going to find an explanation of nature. Like some of the older composers actually, observed out in nature and were inspired by nature and wrote compositional symphonies to honor that. You know, now you're going to find something that, talks about somebody's butt or something, or how round something like that is. Or you're going to find all this hookup stuff that just doesn't matter, you know. And someone's gonna say, "Oh, that's just my culture and everything else." It's lame. Sorry, it's a lame culture. Um, yeah, it's just lame. So it's something to just get over it. Become more intelligent than commenting on someone's body size and how you like to get with that. Okay, so this is what we're talking about: actual meaning. If it's hard for you to find meaning, there's something that you need to change. And yes, this is meant to be wake up and start thinking about things. Okay. I don't apologize for anything. I'm not going to some algorithm. I'm just a real person, a real musician that is tired of stuff. All right. So, meaning is what we need to get to. Ditch the popular stuff and go back. Find the meaning again. Okay. And here's how music it lost its intellectual contract. Okay. There used to be an unspoken agreement. Okay. The composer says, I will build something worth your attention. The listener says, I will meet you halfway. Okay. Now the contract is broken. Now the industry says, we'll give you something easy, and listeners respond accordingly. So that's like a comment on your own intelligence. If you're looking for easy things, your intelligence is very high. And that's what they are saying to you. You're the idiot, they're the smart ones. Okay, keep it in mind. And that's the truth that nobody wants to admit. People didn't stop wanting depth. They stopped being offered it. Think about you're the idiot, they're not. Okay, keep it in mind. You know, and this isn't about elitism or whatever you want to call it. Let's kill a bad argument before it starts. It's not about smart music versus dumb listeners, even though it seems like it is. But is it actually? I just asked you that question a few seconds ago. You know, you could take that both ways. Okay. Some of the most harmonically rich music in history. Here's what it was. It was dance music. It was folk music. It was popular music in the past. The difference wasn't intelligence, but it was intention. Music used to be made by people who believed it mattered, and how the notes connected to each other. Now it mostly matters how songs perform. not how it like connects to each other. Okay, they probably couldn't even tell you how notes correlate to each other. It's hard for them, but it doesn't have to be hard for you. So keep all this in mind. Intelligent listening is what we're going for. So to conclude it, what we lost and how it can come back. Okay. So modern mainstream music, it didn't lose its soul. It traded depth for efficiency. It traded curiosity for certainty. It traded composition for optimization. And the tools still exist. Okay. The knowledge still exists. The listeners still exist. But what's missing is expectation. The expectation that music can do more than fill space. The expectation that it can reward attention. Okay. The expectation that it can teach us how to listen again. And when artists decide to raise that bar again, listeners will rise with it, hopefully, because they always have. And hopefully they'll continue to do so. So if this episode made you uncomfortable, good. That was the point. That means you're actually listening. Oh, look at that, a test. If it makes you rethink what you hear every day, even better. That means you're improving. If you want to explore music the way it used to be approached, with intention, depth, and human intelligence, join me inside Mac's Musical Collective on School. And if you want more long form breakdowns like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Everybody knows how to do that by now. And share this with someone who knows music can be more than background noise. Because listening is a skill and it's one worth protecting. Okay, so I'll see you guys next time in the next episode. Hopefully I can grab your attention again. And if this one made you uncomfortable, I'm glad. It made me happy. But it's a step forward to actually intelligently listening to something. All right, so I'll see you guys next time.